Really get mad when we have to go live. They really get mad when we have to go live while you're.
I didn't see that.
I'm not sure you panicked already.
I shouldn't have. You know it.
Yeah, I know.
We'll be all right. We'll
Eddie, ace, Eddie, step, put, center, ace. Present! Present! Force!
So there are lots of things that you could look at Jimmy Carter that presaged his presidency, and that I think some people would probably think differently today, like when you think about what the typical stereotype is of a Democrat. So definitely not a tax and spend liberal.
And then certainly he takes everything from his governorship and the presidency and parlays it into this post-presidency that is really remarkable. I mean, we keep saying he redefined what a post-presidency was. And that's when you start to really see this focus on human rights, on global human rights and things like that.
Yeah, so I mean, there are a number of things to think about. One, structurally speaking, because he was so young when he exited the presidency, so only in his mid-50s, and he had the benefit of longevity, so he had the time to craft this. Not all presidents have the opportunity to be able to do that. Like, they may not live as long to be able to craft that type of legacy. But he's also cultivating and building on some of his successes. So if you think about his ability to broker the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel, that certainly is cultivating an interest, one, in the region, but also in human rights. And some people actually argue that his focus on civil and human rights in his post-presidency was in some ways a way to try to compensate for the ways that he wasn't vocal about civil rights in the 1950s and 60s, because he was worried about his business or because he was worried about building a political career. But he was able to use that platform. He was able to focus on things that were hard. So for instance, one of the big achievements of the Carter Center is helping to eradicate guinea worm, this debilitating waterborne disease that's present in the developing world, and river blindness. And he did them because they were hard. He did them because they were unheralded. But he's able to have had a tremendous impact on the world, a greater impact, I would actually argue, than he had even as president of the United States.
So that's one thing that's so interesting about this too, is that because he was so young, like you mentioned, Andra, when he finished his time in the Oval Office, he didn't take a long break before he jumped in and started putting the wheels in motion for the Carter Center. Whereas I feel like that's what makes him so different, right? Like the way that this came about, the way he jumped right in and had a goal and had a plan and really executed it, Andra.
Yeah, I mean, so, the idea of presidential libraries is something that's largely a 20th century phenomenon. And if you look at his predecessors, if you look at how quickly, for instance, Lyndon Baines Johnson died after he completed his term and a half as president of the United States, you usually don't see people thinking about, well, what could I do that's going to be a platform for good? I think, part of this was just the idea of trying to compensate for having lost, and an election, that was hard fought and a loss that was certainly bitter. But then it's also thinking of, how do I execute my faith now that I have had the opportunity to be leader of the free world? And so even when you're not president, you still have a large bully pulpit, you have a large platform, and he wanted to figure out a way to do that in a way that would help people, and I would argue honor is God. And so this becomes, his legacy, that he's out there doing good, sometimes on things that aren't necessarily the sexiest issues in the world, but in ways that are going to have an impact on lots of people for years to come.
Yeah, I think guinea worm is a great example of that, something some people just don't want to talk about, and he dove right in through the Carter Center. So we'll talk more about his faith. I think that's such another unique part of his presidency.
You have a lot of insight in that.
Was there and got to go to the Sunday school. So we'll talk about that. But want to get out to Buck Lanford, who of course has spent several days out at the Carter Center. And Buck, I want to start with this. You told us earlier such a great story, and I think this just points to sort of this man of simple means that we think about, that, they're out there at the Carter Center. All these visitors are coming in. And how are they counting the visitors who are walking into the Carter Center?
Yeah, I found this to be so interesting when I found out earlier. I was talking to them, kind of checking in at the media center here, getting any kind of updates, any kind of information that we can find out. So we're kind of keeping a running tally about how many people were coming in to pay their last respects while his body was laying in repose here. And so I asked them how they're keeping up with this tally, and it turns out they had staffers in there literally with clickers, clicking every time somebody came in. And you're talking about a sore thumb. You're talking about clicking more than 23,000 times. I don't imagine it was one staffer the entire time, but more than 23,000 people came in to pay their respects to Jimmy Carter between Saturday evening and 7 a.m. this morning. So I think that does speak volumes, because as Caitlin mentioned, the conditions here, for many reasons, were very difficult, many hurdles. If you just take the fact that the roads were closed and there's no parking, that's probably enough to keep some people away. You've got to take MARTA to a certain station, catch a shuttle to get over here. And then you factor in all of the weather that we've been dealing with this week. torrential rains, freezing temperatures, yet 23,000 plus people came out to pay their respects to the late Jimmy Carter. And it was interesting to see the people that came by, the makeshift memorial behind us. Now, you've seen the makeshift memorial behind us. As we take a live look now at the motorcade, it's on its way to Dobbins Air Reserve Base. But as we take a look at that, I just want to mention that the cross section, and I think you touched on this earlier, Paul, the cross section of people who have been out here from young to old and everything in between. We've had people just walking their dogs, riding bikes, families. It's just been very interesting to see how this man impacted so many people's lives and will continue to, because so many kids, young people who may not have been aware of what Jimmy Carter is or did are being exposed to it through his death. A little bit of perspective from where we were during the ceremony as they left here just a little while ago. So we're in the Triangle. If you're familiar with this area, we're in the Triangle, kind of at the front of the Carter Presidential Center, where the sign is, the makeshift memorial, where people have been leaving flowers and things since he died 9 days ago. But if I look over my right shoulder, and I can't show it to you because it's blocked by trees, but we're about a 5-iron away from the circle of flags where that ceremony took place. So it was so interesting to me to watch it on the television monitor here and listening to it through my earpiece, yet hearing it through my other ear live behind me, hearing the band playing Hail to the Chief, hearing the band playing Blessed Assurance and Amazing Grace, hymns that were very important, obviously, to President Carter. And another thing you mentioned, Paul, earlier, this thing has been in the planning stages. They began planning for this event in 1986. Now, of course, they've amended it and things have changed since then, but this has been a program and 6 days of events long in the making. So I just wanted to point that out as we take a live look at the motorcade once again on its way to Dobbins Air Reserve Base, where he'll load a plane and head to Washington, D.C. for a couple of more days of ceremony and lying in state in the Capitol Rotunda. I'll send it back to you guys in the studio.
Buck, thank you so much for that. We sure appreciate it. I want to follow up on something that he said. He mentioned that this has been in the stages for such a long time, right, Paul. So you have to remember that President Carter played such a role in the songs that were chosen and who is here and every step of the way. This has his fingerprints all over it.
Absolutely. I mean, you're seeing a tradition that has gone on for hundreds of years. I mean, the first real state funeral was for Abraham Lincoln, so this has been going on for a long time, but you're seeing his touches in there too. He chose the hymns. He wanted to be part of this. And of course, you're seeing his family play such a big part because this was such a close family. I don't think that can be overstated, just how close his family is. Many of them still live in Plains. They are very tight, and of course, they have been there through all of this. And again, you're looking live right now at the motorcade. One thing we rarely see in Atlanta is a quiet interstate, and right now that is a quiet interstate as the motorcade moves. It is heading toward Dobbins Air Reserve Base right now, scheduled to be there at 12:10, but I think it's going to be early. This is all moving fairly quickly. They're going to get there. There will be some more ceremony that we will watch live here on Fox 5 Atlanta, and then of course the plane will take off. This will be the 89th Airlift Wing taking off on a special mission to Washington, D.C. Again, scheduled to leave the airport at 12:45. Likely this will happen a little early.
I think so. I think that's what it's looking like time-wise. Angelique Proctor is live on the ground there at Dobbins Air Reserve Base, so she is there ahead of the motorcade arriving. So Angelique, we'll send it out to you. It's about to be the center of action there here in just a few minutes, Angelique.
Absolutely. We're starting to see a lot of movement here on the tarmac here at the Dobbins Air Reserve Base. As you can see, the aircraft behind me here is the Special Air Mission 39. That is the actual plane that will take former President Jimmy Carter's remains and the Carter family. As you said, the Carter family playing very much a vital role in all of this. We'll take them all to the D.C. area. We are told that there are about 195 special guests that have been invited here to actually see the ceremony that will take place here, a ceremony that has been described to us as a silent ceremony. There will apparently be no speakers, but there will be a band, and we are told that that band will play Nearer, My God, to Thee, among other songs. Amongst those who have been invited and are expected to be here, Georgia Governor Brian Kemp, as well as First Lady Marty Kemp. We also have learned that Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens will be here as well. And this will be a very silent and a very reverent ceremony. They have asked us to remain totally quiet during that time, and it's just a matter of paying respect to our 39th president. Of course, the honor guard will be in place, and lots of people will be looking on during this silent ceremony, and we look forward to that starting now because of the weather delays at 12:10. And I am told that the hearse is on its way here now. So once they arrive here, as you can see, there is quite a bit here to receive them, and we will have that ceremony here at Dobbins.
Angelique, I want to ask you on a personal note. You're a Georgia girl, an Atlanta girl through and through. So what can you share with us about President Carter's legacy, what he means to you, and how you think he'll be remembered, Angelique?
Well, you know, President Carter was truly a man of integrity. I was really too young to vote for him when he ran for office, but I remember when he won, both my grandmother and my mother attended his inauguration in Washington, D.C., along with my aunts. And that was such a big deal when they traveled to Washington, D.C. My grandmother did, in fact, know him personally. And when I was a young reporter, I believe in Albany, Georgia, I interviewed President Carter not far from Plains, and I rushed right in, very eager to talk to him, and started shouting out questions. And he immediately said to me, "Young lady, you might want to ask me if I would like to do an interview first." And so he was always a very decent individual, quickly put me in my place. And so I did, in fact, end up covering him for decades. And he is a man that has touched not only this state, but this nation. As I've talked to so many people this week, so many people revere the work that he did and have so much regard for all of the people that he helped, because at his core, he was really a humanitarian, and all of these other things just kind of went along with it. Becoming governor, becoming president, winning the Nobel Peace Prize. What he really wanted to do was to help his fellow man, and my gosh, has he been just an incredible example for all of us.
Angelique, we know you well, and we know you're a professional, so we know to this day you ask people, do you mind if we do an interview before you start the interview? A life lesson, right?
Absolutely.
Oh, goodness.
It absolutely was from President Carter, yes.
Incredible.
Fascinating. Angelique, thank you so much for that. I know we'll be checking back in with you here in just a little
bit.
Yeah, very shortly, very shortly. Andra, I want to talk more about the work that President Carter did. You know, the Carter Center up and running for over 40 years. You mentioned a few of the incredible things that were done through the work of the Carter Center. We have to mention, though, Habitat for Humanity, which was so near and dear to President Carter's heart. All the homes built, all the work that he put into that, Andra.
Yeah, so it combines a number of threads of President Carter's life. So first, his love of woodworking. So when he ended his presidency, his staff gave him a woodworking set, and he made lots of furniture. I believe some of it is at the Carter Center. A lot of it is at the private family home in Plains. And so he was certainly putting his woodworking skills to use with carpentry. It certainly provided a platform for him to do good. And his efforts helped to amplify and basically put Habitat for Humanity on the map. The other part of it that's actually really interesting, and this goes back to President Carter perhaps not being as vocal an advocate of civil rights at the height of the movement, and him trying to make up for that. Habitat for Humanity kind of came out of this communal Christian space that was in Southwest Georgia called Koinonia Farm, I believe. And, you know, they were maligned, you know, in Sumter County and in the area for, you know, promoting racial integration and harmony. But it was members of that community who founded Habitat for Humanity. And so by working with them in his post-presidency, in some ways this was compensation for not necessarily being as vocal a defender of this particular community. You know, Billy, his brother, who, you know, also helped to run the family warehouse, did business with them when other people would not do business with them. But there were ways where he was sympathetic but wouldn't necessarily stick his neck out for that particular community. And by helping members of this community sort of amplify this housing ministry that they had, I think this was a a way to try to make up for things that he could have done differently when he was younger.
And I think this goes back to something we talked about earlier, which is that this was an evolving human being. He, like all of us, grew and changed. Sure. And seems like as the years went on, we saw more and more of his faith being put into practice. Talk about how you would characterize the way that he used his faith throughout his life and career.
Yeah, I mean, so he would talk about, having grown up in the church, but if you're familiar with evangelical philosophy and doctrine, you have to have a moment where you make a decision to follow Christ. He would describe his conversion as something that was gradual and took place over time. But after he lost his gubernatorial bid in 1966, he had a real soul searching about sort of the meaning of life and whether or not his life was meaningful. And his sister, who was a charismatic Christian, kind of really compelled him to try to put God first. And so it was through her mentoring and discipleship, if you will, that he kind of came to have a more personal relationship with Christ. It became more fundamental kind of to his political identity when he ran for president in 1976. So remember, America is still reeling from the heels of Watergate.
Sure.
So you have this scandal, you have corruption, and when Carter was presenting himself as an outsider, he's not just presenting himself as from the party that wasn't involved in Watergate, and he's not just presenting himself as a reformer to try to undo some of the corruption that people associated with the Nixon administration, and he's also presenting himself as a non-DC or Beltway insider. He's also saying, like, from an ethical and reform standpoint, I have a moral compass that is outside of myself.
Yeah.
I mean, and he was made fun of for this, right? When talking about being born again, when sort of admitting sin and talking about his own frailties, right? He goes back and sort of thinks about not just what you do, but also what you think, kind of being at the heart of people's action. And so people think about that infamous Playboy interview where he talks about, committing adultery, not because he cheated on Rosalind, because he didn't, but because he lusted after women in his heart, and that was tantamount to adultery. I mean, he's pulling right from the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah.
And so evangelicals would certainly recognize that, but that's something that certainly made fodder for
the
late
wider
night jokes.
public.
Yeah,
Sure.
And I think so interesting too that you put it into the context of Watergate, because here, coming out of this period of turmoil, of course, Vietnam War, then Watergate, and then you have a guy standing up saying, "I will never lie to you," and that was key to his getting elected.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a sad commentary on religion and politics today that if you had a politician who professed a strong faith who said, "I will not lie to you," I'm not sure people would believe it today.
Right.
In the same way. But in 1976, people believed it because he wasn't just saying, "I'm a politician, I won't lie to you." He's saying, "My faith informs this pledge to you that I'm going to try to live my hardest by, because I would be understanding that I would be breaking a commandment and sinning if I did."
Yeah.
Andra Gillespie joining us from Emory University. We're going to check back in with Buck Lanford joining us on the ground at the Carter Center. And Buck, can you give us an idea of what we can expect after the events that we're seeing right now? Of course, the motorcade headed to Dobbins Air Reserve Base. It'll then be headed to Joint Base Andrews and the ceremony that'll happen there in D.C. So, Buck, what can you tell us about what we can expect from that?
Yeah, so they'll leave Cobb County and head to Joint Base Andrews, as you say, which is in Maryland. And from there, with full military honors, they'll load the hearse there at Joint Base Andrews en route to the U.S. Capitol. But they're going to stop on the way in honor of his military service at the U.S. Navy Memorial. Now, I hope the snow is not going to mess up what they had planned there. But the plan there was to take his casket from the hearse and load it into what they call a horse-drawn caisson, which is basically a horse-drawn carriage. A caisson, I looked it up, it's basically like a wagon. And they're going to, for the last leg of that journey to the U.S. Capitol. Once again, I don't know if that's still the case, because I know they've had so much snow up there, but I think that would be such an interesting tribute and a great way to honor him. So I hope that's able to work out. From there, they will take him to the U.S. Capitol, where he'll lie in state until midnight tonight, and then of course there'll be the funeral tomorrow at the National Cathedral. After that, his body will be taken back here to Georgia, where he'll ultimately head back to his hometown of Plains. They'll have a family service there, and he'll be buried right next to where he should be, his wife of 77 years, Rosalind, right there on their property by a lake that he helped dig under a historic willow tree. So certainly a fitting place for him to to rest permanently, and it'll be part of a historical park opportunity for people to be able to come by and see it. And certainly, I think this is a man who put Plains, Georgia on the map statewide, nationally, and internationally, and I think that'll continue to be the case now in death, that so many people are going to be interested in the life of Jimmy Carter, and certainly I think a lot of people will want to go by there and check out the history taking place right there in Plains, Georgia. So that's the plan as of right now. He left here, I don't know, about a half an hour ago, en route to Dobbins Air Reserve Base. He'll be there any second, and left really the Carter Center. When you think about it, this place built in 1982, the place that Jimmy built, basically left here for the last time, for the final time. Send it back to you guys.
The finality of that. Wow. All right, Buck, thank you.
So again, right now we're looking live at Dobbins Air Reserve Base. This is the next stop as we go from stage 1 of the state funeral to stage 2. He'll be taken up to Washington, D.C. And Andra Gillespie, we were just saying, he'll be taken by the U.S. Navy Memorial. There's a reason for that. He served our country in the U.S. Navy.
Yeah, and so that would be one of the personalized touches that President Carter likely chose himself when he was planning his funeral. The reporter mentioned the caisson, and that was something that President Ford actually didn't want to have happen at his funeral, so he was able to choose not to do that. And I think it's also really significant because we don't think about it, but President Carter was the last living president for now who had served in the military, and so like that type of personal touch is something that we may not see in the funerals of the current presidents, who are living when it's their time to have their state funeral.
Very interesting. Let's talk a little bit more about this, Andra, about his time in the military, his time in the Navy. What can you share with us about that?
Well, I mean, I think many people thought, and Carter may have himself thought, that he was going to have like a full career in the U.S. Navy. It was cut short because his father died. Billy was substantially younger and wasn't old enough to take over the family business when his father passed away in 1953. But he was determined to make it to the U.S. Naval Academy. He had determined when he was a young boy that was what he wanted to do. Coming out of rural South Georgia, he wasn't necessarily prepared academically to do that, so he took some time, in college in America. He was at Georgia Tech for a while, and then when he finally got his papers, to be able to go to the United States Naval Academy, he served there, and that was where he graduated. It was interesting that at that time, the Naval Academy was starting to integrate, and so there's the story of one of the first black people who was enrolled at Annapolis, who was treated badly by other white students, and Carter was notable for being kinder to him, not necessarily being a vocal advocate of civil rights, but being decent to him, and that was certainly something that mattered. After he got his commission and is serving in the Navy, he ended up becoming part of a very elite group of nuclear kind of engineers who were working on submarines, working for a very, very taxing commander, and so this is where we thought his career would go, and then life circumstances changed and he had to go back to Georgia.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? He was honorably discharged when his father passed away, but then that opened the door to this entire other life and career. So many of us have personal connections with President Carter, yourself included. You were more than just someone watching him. You were his colleague at Emory.
Yes. So, technically, he was a member of our faculty, a tenured member of our faculty, and so he didn't have to go to faculty meetings like the rest of us. But he would use his faculty position to try to bless the entire Emory community. So generations of Emory students knew that they were going to have their conversation with Jimmy Carter sort of at the start of their freshman year. For faculty, he would invite people to come to lunch with him periodically. And so myself included, and a lot of my colleagues, talk very fondly about the time that we got to have lunch with President Carter. I myself was scared the day that it happened to me. And President Carter would sometimes randomly pick your class to come teach. So I remember getting like that email probably about 12 or 13 years ago saying, President Carter's coming to your class on such and such day. And so I was, there was no negotiation. I do think I sent my syllabus just so that he would kind of know what I had planned on talking about that day. But he came to class and taught my class. He talked about what he wanted to talk about. But what he said that day is something that I have repeated for the edification of my students ever since.
Wow.
Incredible, incredible. I want to know more about these lunches. Like what was was that President Carter like when you sit down with him to have lunch? What was the conversation like from him?
It was very, very kind. Like, I remember being terrified, so there is a lot that I don't remember about that lunch. I do remember what I ate. I can remember what President Carter ate, and I remembered he had seen me quoted somewhere in the local Atlanta press about a particular issue, and he was like, I agree with you on that. And so, you know, it's humbling to have a former president of the United States, one, know who you are, and then two, to say that he agreed with you on a particular issue. I mean, it's something that I will treasure, but like there was just so much going on that day. It happened at about this time of year. So for those of you who are familiar in evangelical circles, I was on a Daniel fast, so I was very preoccupied with what I couldn't eat at this meal, and just worried that I had messed the whole thing up and just like, you know, made a bad first impression on President Carter. But he was very, very kind, very, very kind, and engaged everybody who he invited. So he usually had small groups of about 4 or 5 faculty members that he would talk to from different fields.
Wow, what an honor.
Yeah. What an honor. And of course you remember so much about that because, I mean, what an opportunity, what a moment to have with him. Yeah, so special.
And something else that I found about him being part of his Sunday school class, I think a lot of people will echo this, he was really funny too. He's a man that could crack a joke. Did you remember that? Was that your experience too?
I don't remember jokes, but I do remember him being very kind. I wasn't prepared, like when he came to teach my class. A couple of years later, one of my colleagues had him come to her class and she hired a videographer, and I thought about it and went, oh, I should have done that. Oh, yeah. And so like the picture that I got was a terrible picture on a flip phone that's highly pixelated and not particularly useful. I think one of my former students who doesn't live in this media market, but who I will email afterwards, did get a better picture on his phone, but just the fact that he was willing, you know, to sit with the students and to engage with them. And my now senior associate dean has his endowed chair and would invite Jimmy Carter to a particular class where they would talk about his administration, and the fact that they would, you know, talk about their research and then have President Carter riff on, here's what I remember from that thing that you just wrote a paper about. And you just think about what the privilege it is for that to happen. Not just that, my students, I've had at least one student, perhaps more than one, who got to go with the Carters on election observation trips. And so like when we think about not just civil and human rights, but also their commitment to democratization at the Carter Center, and like what an opportunity to be able to travel abroad with a former president of the United States while you watch and help other countries, you know, vote and participate in the democratic process. It's amazing, and you know, I feel really privileged to, you know, to have been able to count President Carter as a colleague in that respect.
Of course. You know what? We've talked so much about President Carter, and we'll continue to do that, but we have to attach that name to Rosalind, his wife of 77 years. Absolutely incredible, and in the beginning of their love story. I mean, it knew each other literally from birth and from the cradle and on. Let's talk about that, about their life together, their relationship, and how he's even said that, you know, she played a very active role in his life politically and sat in on meetings and did all kinds of things as his wife.
Yeah, so I mean, Rosalind Carter, he says marrying her was the best decision that he ever made. So she truly was a partner in that relationship. And, you know, he had to learn and grow in that relationship as well. There were certain decisions that he made, sometimes without consulting her early in the marriage, that certainly would have caused a strain, but they were able to work through it. When they went back to Plains, she was not happy about having to go back. She had gotten used to the freedom of being a Navy wife and moving around and seeing different parts of the world. But when she went back to Plains, she helped his business. She learned how to do accounting. She was managing the books of his business. And so when he became president of the United States, she sat and took notes in cabinet meetings. And there were lots of people who thought that that was an inappropriate role for a first lady. But what she was setting up was sort of a permission structure for first ladies to be active in the policy space for their husbands. And so you don't get a Hillary Clinton unless you have a Rosalind Carter sitting in on meetings, the same way you don't get a Hillary Clinton without thinking about Eleanor Roosevelt's activism. So I think that she should be discussed. And then if we think about some of the things that she was doing, her platform, if you could argue that she had one, was certainly about mental health. President Carter, you know, nominated her as being an honorary chairperson to a commission on mental health. That was certainly something that was near and dear to her heart, but literacy was also something that was actually also really important to her, childhood vaccinations. And so if you think about about a lot of the things that the Carter Center did in that post-presidency, these were not just things that Jimmy Carter cared about. Rosalind Carter cared about these issues, and you know, had a level of expertise as well.
And then aside from his wife, you know, they had 4 children. I think he had 20-some grandchildren, some of whom also went into politics. So he obviously, his political spirit and that spirit to help and better the world was passed down to the next generation.
Yes, and we saw many of them sort of, you know, outside saluting the patriarch of their family. So, you know, we have to think about what it might mean for them to have lost their patriarch. They had him for 100 years. So, you know, many people don't get their grandparents for that long. But when you do have a long living grandparent, that means you get really attached. And so this is a really hard time for them. I think many people around here in Atlanta know Jason Carter, who's a former state senator. He was candidate for governor in 2014. I think he very much embodies the spirit of his grandfather and his involvement in politics. And so, you know, I remember when I first met Jason, we talked about having grandfathers who were about the same age who were farmers and sometimes somewhat similar temperaments. And so, yeah, you could see sort of how that ethos is still very apparent in the family. And even though I didn't see members of the Carter family when I went yesterday to the Carter Center, I remember when Rosalind died, meeting Becky Carter, and you know, just the friendliness and sort of the gratitude. I mean, there certainly is sort of an ethos and a very hospitable spirit within that family.
And I think what you're saying is something that we've talked about a lot, is that the access that people had to President Carter and his family seems like something we may never see again. You go down to Plains, you will see his niece working at the visitor center. You see his children, his grandchildren
attending
everywhere.
schools here locally.
And going to his Sunday school, seeing him up close. This kind of access really gave people a personal connection that we may not see again.
Yeah, I mean, some of this because of security, and some of it is different presidents have different types of personalities.
Sure.
And so, you know, the Carters were committed to coming back to the community that had raised them and that had blessed them and that they had been a vital part of. And so, you know, you won't necessarily see that type of mix when you see presidents serve and then they don't go back to their hometowns for various reasons after the fact. They're placed in spaces where presidential libraries actually can be a place where they can get to know certain types of people. So it's not just President Carter. I think about George H.W. Bush. And, you know, like the Carters, there was a living space kind of in the presidential library. There's certainly a certain type of mentorship. You know, in terms of thinking about certain bespoke features, the Bushes are buried at their presidential library. And so I remembered going to the burial site before they died, like seeing their names ready to kind of receive them upon their death. Their daughter was already buried there. But I also know that they mentored a future congressman, you know, who happened to be a student at Texas A&M University. And so sometimes these presidential libraries are the places where presidents can put their input and where they can continue to engage with communities in a really safe and secure way.
Yeah.
For those of you who are just joining us right now, we are preparing to see the motorcade roll up there at Dobbins Air Reserve Base, and looking at the plane there, we have Special Air Mission 39 preparing to depart to Joint Base Andrews, where it will then process into Washington D.C., where we'll continue this part 3, I guess we could call it, stage 3 of what we're seeing. So it's been a full day, and I got to tell you, Paul, I think we're still running a little bit ahead of schedule when it comes to when they're expected to arrive there at Dobbins Air Reserve Base. But yeah, will happen here in just a few minutes.
Yeah, we had expected it around 10 after 12. It's 11:55. I think he'll get there within the next 5 minutes. You see some activity there in the live picture in the corner, so we'll be watching this really closely. As you said, they're going to arrive. There will be more ceremony there. And as Angelique Proctor pointed out, they've requested it be a quiet ceremony. So you're not going to hear Angelique Proctor speaking to us during it. They asked the media, please be respectful, have a moment of silence when this is going on. And so they will arrive, the family will disembark, of course, then his remains will be transferred onto the airplane. You'll hear some music. There is a band there, so you're going to hear some music. I think Angelique mentioned they'll play Nearer My God to Thee. They're also going to do Hail to the Chief. There will also be a 21-gun salute. So we will listen into all of that happening, but you're not going to hear speakers and things like that. It's going to be a little more somber and quiet because, of course, President Jimmy Carter is leaving Georgia. He will be back, but he's leaving to go up to Washington, D.C.
Sure. Right now, we're seeing invited guests who have made it there to be able to witness this firsthand, a front row seat for that. I believe I see Governor Kemp
I think
there.
that's Governor Brian Kemp front and center as well. It's hard to tell on our monitors, but I think he's right there in the center. These are, as you said, some special guests. I think Angelique mentioned. In fact, I think that's Mayor Andre Dickens on the side of your screen right there.
Yes, that is him.
So you're seeing these folks gather, awaiting the arrival of the motorcade. Again, it should be there within the next couple of minutes, and then that ceremony will begin. Earlier, they had said that the plane, and this is, as you mentioned before, being flown by the 89th Airlift Wing, would be taking off around 12:45. I think it's going to be earlier than that. It seems to be moving ahead of schedule. As the military often, they're either precise or ahead of schedule, right? That's what we would expect on this.
Of course. So soon after, when the hearse arrives, the family will arrive as part of that motorcade. And I want to talk about them for a moment. The loss of Rosalind last year, and then now, of course, former President Carter. I can imagine that for them, it's a somber moment, but it's one that has to be meaningful to see all of these faces showing up, to hear, people expressing their support from here in Georgia, from all across the world, for a life well lived. And that's something that has to really stick with them, Andra, and be needed, right, at this difficult time for them.
Yeah, so, I wouldn't be surprised if people are reflecting, if the family isn't reflecting on just the impact that his life had, and that they can take pride in that. And they can take pride in the fact that it was a long life. So it wasn't just a life well lived, but that it was a long life where he got to do pretty much everything that he wanted to do. I think that faith also matters here. This is a family who believes that they will see him again. And so this is, this is a so long for now. This isn't a permanent and final goodbye for them. And so I imagine that those who have faith in that family are actually taking comfort in that. And they're also taking comfort in the fact that he's now with his beloved Rosalind. And so I think about that Mike Lukovich, cartoon that was in the AJC last week, that they were going to be reunited at the gates of heaven.
Yeah, it's so beautiful to see. I think what you're saying, it makes a lot of sense when you think about a family that, like you said, has had him at the center for 100 years. It's been a very, very long time. And so the solace that I'm sure they can take, and that his longtime admirers can take, is that he set up the Carter Center in a way it will continue. It will outlast all of us, and his good work around the world will continue.
Yes, I mean, and especially sort of in his later years when he was battling cancer and wasn't as mobile as he used to be, you saw kind of a prototype for what the Carter Center will look like now that he has passed on. And so, I don't expect that anything will change significantly. They're still going to be doing programs. The museum is still going to be the museum. Researchers will still have access to the library so that they can go through the presidential archives and be able to write more books about his presidency and its legacy. And so, this is one moment that was inevitable, but the work will continue.
And really quickly, speaking of books, this man's words will live with us forever. He wrote 32 books in his life, an incredible literary body of work that we have to study and learn from forever. And,
it's varied. I mean, some of it is nonfiction where he's talking about politics. He wrote religious books,
children's books too, right?
Children's books. Yeah. He wrote poetry. So he was definitely a polymathic figure. And so it doesn't matter. I doubt you'll be able to read all of them, or that most people will. You can read 30 books. I do acknowledge that.
Start a new book club for that, right?
For that. But he wrote something that you will be interested in, even if you don't want to read all 30 of those books.
Right. We talked about this morning. He ended up winning 3 Grammy Awards for the audiobook versions of those books, so you can still hear him telling his story when you listen to the audiobooks.
A Grammy winner. Something else that was part of your story today, Paul, I thought was so interesting and so fitting for him. It's how many books he signed.
He hand-signed.
Yes.
Yes. So we went to Atlanta Vintage Books over in Chamblee. They have a large collection of his books, and they talked about how he really was out there with his books, signing them for people, and those are treasured collectibles for folks forever now.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think it speaks to his accessibility.
Yes.
Just this idea that, he was a member of the community, he was a neighbor, and he certainly wanted to, be able to engage with people and interact with folks, even though by all accounts he tended to be kind of shy and reserved.
Oh, that's interesting to hear.
Really?
Yeah. So I mean, there's you could probably argue that he's some type of public extrovert, but that privately he's somebody who was a little bit pensive.
Huh. That is so interesting. I promise you, it seems as every day these new revelations about him come out.
Indeed.
And it's so incredibly interesting. It truly is. Yeah.
Well, what a man of varied interests. You mentioned before the woodworking. He did winemaking. He, of course, was a farmer. He was a writer. He was a painter. The Carter Center has some of his beautiful paintings.
Yeah, I mean, I think the word polymath would certainly describe his interests and the things that he excelled at and that he was willing to try his hand at.
Yeah, you know what else? We had a story this week about his role in the movie industry
right.
Here in Georgia as well. So kind of going along with what you said, Paul, he really did have his hand in so many different things that have helped to shape Georgia and to make it what it is today.
Yeah, a lot of state parks, we have Jimmy Carter to thank that they exist today. He consolidated more than 30 agencies into the DNR and was instrumental in saving and preserving a lot of public land. So that's, again, just another little piece of his legacy. There are so many pieces of his legacy. That goes back to that governorship. We're so focused today on him, of course, being the president of the United States. He had a huge impact on Georgia as governor as well.
Yeah, and so the things that he did in terms of natural resources translate into things that he did as president of the United States. So including expanding sort of, what would be considered protected lands and expanding the imprint of national parks in the United States. It was in his administration that you start to see Superfund sites. So environmental kind of toxic dumps that needed to be cleaned up and making sure that resources were provided for those. So, you could fixate on inflation in the late 70s and 1980s. You could fixate on the Iran hostage crisis, which were certainly low points of his presidency, but you forget everything else that he did. He installed solar panels.
I was just going to ask you about that.
On the roof of the White House. Ronald Reagan
you.
took them down, but in some of the reporting this week, some of those solar panels that were put up are actually still in use today in various places around the world.
How about that?
And just the idea that perhaps people would be wanting to look for cheap electricity is something that, is something that we would think about today. And so I think we would view him as actually being pretty prescient, even if people misunderstood and didn't appreciate what he was doing at the time that he was doing.
Ahead of his time in so many ways. On a lighter note, I thought about this as we saw that box of video that's up on your screen right now. President Carter loved a kiss cam. He loved
he sure did.
kiss
He
cam.
sure did. Yeah. Well, when you've been with your wife for 77 years, there's affection there.
There's
for
affection.
Sure, right?
You know what I've always loved, and I've said it this week a few times. I love that he really went in for that kiss with her. It wasn't just that light little peck. I mean, he would kiss Rosalind when they were up on that screen.
Yeah.
Loved it. So precious. 77 years married to her.
Yeah, incredible.
Amazing.
That's certainly something people will carry forward, that example of them as a unit, as a couple. Also, we just saw a little video there of him teaching Sunday school. That was such a unique part of his post-presidency that at least once a month, he would be there in Plains at Maranatha Baptist Church teaching Sunday school. And that also goes back to the access of people being able to sit there in the church in front of a president.
Yeah. I mean, so if you've ever gone to a church with a president, or when they think a president is going to show up at church, you do kind of still have to go through a metal detector. So I imagine that you probably still had to do that at Maranatha.
Yeah, there was certainly security in place. The interesting thing is, though, when he walked out, as I'm sure you experienced at Emory as well, it's sort of all attention was on him, and you forgot everything else was there. If there were Secret Service standing close by, you certainly didn't notice them. You were fixated right on that figure up front. And when we were there, and this is back in 2019, people had camped out for 20 hours to see him. They had been there since the day before, spent the night in the parking lot, to be there just to get an experience of seeing a former president and this living legend in front of them.
Yeah, my neighbors and I talked about doing it. The pandemic interrupted us, and we didn't realize that he really wasn't teaching even at the beginning of 2020 before the pandemic sort of caused lockdowns. But my neighbors and I were scheming to do one of those road trips down so that we could go to Sunday school.
Yeah, so many have. Many have. Something else I've heard that he would do at the end of that service, and I guess you could confirm this since you were there, he would take pictures with those who were there. I mean, didn't have to do that. Took the time to shake a hand and to take a picture. And I think it just speaks volume. It speaks to who he was as a person.
And it also, I think shows that he was a master of retail politicking. And it was that type of retail politicking that certainly helped him win the governorship in 1970. It was certainly something that helped him secure the Democratic nomination in 1976. And this is where he could overcome some of his seriousness and his shyness by learning how to talk to and interact with people. And I think we kind of discount that. I think you think about more charismatic political figures and presidents like Bill Clinton, where you kind of know that he's good, when he's on the rope line with people. But Jimmy Carter cultivated this not just in terms of his accessibility as president, not just by knocking on doors, but also, he was doing door-to-door missionary work in between, his losing the governorship and winning it. And so while the purpose of that was to evangelize and to tell people about Jesus, right, he's also picking up really important social skills about how to learn to, ask people for their votes at their doors in person.
Yeah, so interesting. Something else I want to talk briefly about, Andra, is the attitude that President Carter had when he didn't win re-election for president. I love what he said. He said he was involuntarily retired. Those are his words from 1981. Of course, he then took that and returned home and started the Carter Center and all the work that went along with that. But you have to speak to that perspective that he had on that, the attitude that he had about that. I mean, I feel like the majority of us could have had a much different attitude when we're talking about losing the presidential election than what he did.
Yeah, I mean, so this is about being real. So when he's saying involuntarily retired, he's admitting that this hurt. It certainly isn't a good feeling to lose an election. It certainly wasn't a good feeling to have his campaign undermined by external events in the world, but also by being challenged by Ted Kennedy in the Democratic primary. And so I think he is giving himself space to grieve, but his moving forward and his creating the Carter Center, I think, is an example of him kind of moving beyond bitterness to doing something that's actually going to be more productive and something that's going to edify, what proved to be the entire world.
And as we speak, the motorcade is arriving at Dobbins Air Reserve Base. You see our camera shot has moved off of the crowd of guests, including Governor Brian Kemp and Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens. And you see the vehicles are now moving in there at Dobbins Air Reserve Base. Actually right on schedule. We thought it was going to happen at 12:10. It is happening right as we hit 12:10. So they're pulling in there. Of course, a ceremony will be taking place. You will see it be very quiet, though, as Anjali Proctor's out there and mentioned they have requested it be a quiet ceremony. There will be a band, but you won't hear any speakers. You're not going to hear the media speaking and making noises. It'll be somber as the band plays. There will be a 21-gun salute. His remains will be taken and, of course, put on the plane, and then they will head up to Washington, D.C.
Yes, for all the ceremony that involves. We see the hearse right there carrying the body of President Carter, and it's followed by a motorcade there that includes the Carter family, and I know that they will be boarding a flight that will be headed to Joint Base Andrews today. And really that kicks off the beginning of what is a whole separate part of this ceremony involving President Carter there in D.C.
Right. There are 3 stages to a state funeral. We've been through stage 1. That is in the state in which the president lives. So, of course, that was here in Georgia. Stage 2 is in Washington, D.C. So, as you said, that'll be the next couple of days. Stage 3 is when he comes to the state where he'll be interred. And, of course, that will be right back here in Georgia. The U.S. Capitol invitees today, we just got the list. The honorary pallbearers, so watch this, will be the Carter grandchildren. So they will be the honorary pallbearers there. Of course, the Vice President of the United States is going to be there. Kamala Harris, the General Assembly of the United States, current state governors, and the members of President Carter's cabinet will be there as well. So they were all invited to be there at the U.S. Capitol as ceremonies continue. So what's going to happen is the plane will depart probably in about a half an hour or so. Of course, it'll be up in the air. And then when it lands again, we will come back on air. We'll be with you to show you all of the ceremonies that accompany that. We've been talking, Andra, the state funeral is something that is very formal. These plans have been set in stone for a long time. And of course, every president gets a state funeral. But there are those little touches that are personal to President Carter, some of which have to do with his military service. Yeah, so those are going to be bespoke. So he's going to go by a naval memorial. Right. And that certainly is going to sort of capture his service. And I would expect that in the state funeral, the readings would have been chosen by him. I can't confirm this, but I would imagine that that's the case. Yeah. Some of the personal reflections, of course, are obviously going to be tailored to him. Some of the musical selections, right? Like these are places where you can see President Carter having put his touch on his own funeral. Right. I think Buck said these funeral plans began in 1986. That is what Let's remember, that is almost 40 years ago. Incredible. So 40 years of planning this, of making sure it is exactly what President Carter and his family wanted. And so that's what we're seeing play out today. So there is the hearse. which is right there at Dobbins Air Reserve Base. We are watching it live come to a stop. So this is just about where that ceremony is going to begin.
Yeah,
Again,
right
you're
behind
gonna
it there,
hear-
you're seeing Special Air Mission 39 preparing to take the body to Joint Base Andrews there in Maryland.
So we're going to hear the band play. As Anjali Proctor mentioned, you'll hear Nearer My God to Thee. They'll play a Hail to the Chief. There will be a 21-gun salute. And then what you're going to see, sort of the procession, is going to be the national color first, then the clergy, the body bearer team with Mr. Carter's remains, and then the presidential color. And once the body bearers place the casket on the aircraft loader, the casket will move out of sight, and then the family begins to board after that.
I think the tone of this is meant to be somber in what you're saying. You know, there's not a speaker that's here. This is to be reflective, and I know that we will honor that here as things really get set in motion as well. But again, going back to the music that was selected for this, you know it was intentional. You know that this is paying homage to President Carter's faith, and I can only imagine the thought that went into him selecting the music that we've heard today, Andra.
Yeah, I mean, so certain hymns are somewhat universal, so it's not a surprise that he would pick something like Amazing Grace.
Sure.
But the idea of picking something like Nearer My God to Thee. So evangelicals believe that absent from the body is present with the Lord. So as he, has passed on, he's now closer to his God. He's with God.
All right, well, the casket is being removed. We're going to watch and listen for a few moments. again, you are watching ongoing live coverage of the state funeral of President Jimmy Carter. We are going from stage 1 here in Georgia to stage 2 in Washington, D.C. His remains were just loaded onto the airplane, which will take him up to Washington, D.C. And live, Elise, this is his family, large group of his family boarding the plane.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, you live 100 years, you have the opportunity to have a very large family, which is what we're seeing. And Paul, you mentioned that some of his grandchildren will be the honorary pallbearers, right?
Up at the U.S. Capitol,
yeah,
correct. So
soon.
the airplane, as we've been saying, will fly up to Maryland. He will go into D.C. There will be a procession. We, of course, will watch that live on Fox 5 Atlanta. When he gets to the U.S. Capitol, the invitees, the invitation list includes the honorary pallbearers, who are his grandchildren. So I think you see some of them there on the steps as we speak. Invited guests include the Vice President of the United States, so Kamala Harris, the General Assembly of the United States, current state governors, and members of President Carter's cabinet. There will be several eulogies as well. And then, of course, he'll lie in state during the day tomorrow. So people in Washington, D.C. will have the chance to do what we were able to do while President Carter was lying in repose at the Carter Center. Absolutely.
He'll be there tonight from 7 p.m. until midnight. We saw tens of thousands, like Paul mentioned, here at the Carter Center paying their respects. Can expect to see the same thing that's going to happen there in D.C. But going back to what we just saw here, Paul, you get the feeling that it was very intentional to have the music that, of course, we had that was provided by the Maneuver Center of Excellence Band from Fort Benning, Georgia. You might have recognized one of the songs that was played, Near My God to Thee, of course, you know, paying tribute to President Carter's faith, but really just a time there with the quietness to be able to reflect on a life well lived, 100 years well lived.
Yeah, I mean, so I look at this, and you talked about having smaller families. I have a family that's about that big. And so I think about how we line up outside of the church that my great-grandfather pastored. And it's very similar. Like, we're not trying to get on a plane, to try to, take our patriarch's remains to the U.S. Capitol. But this is an opportunity for you to start that process of saying goodbye, and then for also you to honor the life and the legacy and the lessons that are learned. So, I can't get into the Carter family's head, but, they're thinking about, okay, they're starting the slow process of saying goodbye, and then they're also probably thinking about the good times and the good memories. And what a blessing it is, not just to live 100 years, but he's got great grandchildren that are approaching adulthood if they haven't already gotten there. And so the fact that you can live and not just see your children and your grandchildren thrive, but also see your great grandchildren start to hit those milestones, like, that's certainly the blessing of a long life.
A blessing.
Andre, you were one of those who paid your respects here at the Carter Center. You said you spoke to people there, and sort of the overriding feeling is, while this has been expected and prepared for very intentionally, when it happens, there's still that moment of, here we are. It has happened. Now we have to start doing all of these things and honoring him. And it sort of takes a moment, doesn't it, to let it sink in that somebody who's been part of our lives for a very long time has passed away.
Yeah, I mean, I thought about that as I walked on the grounds of the Carter Center. I was last there in November doing a joint program that my center at Emory was co-sponsoring with the Carter Center. And then I thought, as I walked onto the grounds to get into the line, that, oh wow, this is the first time I'm walking on the grounds of the Carter Center and President Carter isn't here. And it's not that he was there most of the time when I went to the Carter Center, but it was just that realization that the world has changed a little bit. And so I think for his staff, they've prepared for this for a long period of time, but that doesn't minimize the hurt. That doesn't minimize the grief. And so now that part of the ceremony is over, they're going to have a chance to sit and to reflect and to mourn and to grieve. And the same is going to be the case for the family after Thursday. Thursday, when all of the family leaves, in the traditional sense, when the casseroles stop coming, that's when you come face to face with your grief and your loss and your understanding that you're now going to interact with your family member in a different way now than you did before when they were here.
That's something that, Andrea, I know brings them comfort as a believer myself, and knowing that they are, and of course that President Carter was, is that he knew where he was going, and he was actually quoted as saying that he didn't fear death because he knew where he was going. And the peace that has to give his family and all of those who loved him, I mean, is incredible.
Yeah, no, and I think that that's something that they will take comfort in. From what I understand, among his last words, I don't know if they were exactly his last words, were he was ready to go see his Rosalind. And so just the idea of sort of being reunited with her in heaven, and the idea that he was ready to go at this particular point, I think is something that his family will likely take comfort in the days and weeks to come. Sure.
And what's wonderful is if we ever question what his religious beliefs were, all we have to do is go to his texts. We mentioned before he wrote 32 books, and there were books about religion, his own beliefs and his own experience as a Christian.
Yeah, I mean, he wrote a devotional that I remember buying as a graduate student. You know, if you didn't get a chance to go to his Sunday school lessons, perhaps if you live in Georgia, you know somebody who did. You know, he didn't necessarily always, you know, agree with his church. So very famously split from Plains Baptist Church over the issue of integration and race. You know, he certainly wouldn't have considered himself a Southern Baptist. So I think it's important to sort of know the ways that his version of evangelical Christianity might deviate from what popular notions of that are today, and certainly from, you know, what some mainstream televangelists would probably sort of put forth as doctrine today. But he, you know, was influenced by Reinhold Niebuhr and sort of the idea of social justice. He was influenced by Paul Tillich. There are, you know, theologians who would be recognizable to lots of people who study these things today. And you could see how he was trying to implement sort of the tenets of his faith in his everyday life.
Now, we talk about him knowing where he was going after death, but it's so interesting too, the beauty and the fact that he's reunited with Rosalind in heaven, of course, but the fact that their physical bodies will be buried together at their home in Plains, just beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, and this is also another one of those bespoke choices. Some presidents choose to be buried at their presidential libraries. Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan, for instance, at their library. George and Barbara Bush, they chose to be buried at home in Plains, and there are parts of Plains that are certainly museums, and we expect that that museum space is going to expand in town, but they chose to be buried at home. They didn't choose to be buried at the Carter Center as they could have chosen. And the idea that they chose their resting place.
Right.
You know,
a special treat to
them,
right?
To be able to do that. I was talking with my own mother about this when I was like, oh yeah, they're going to get buried under a willow tree. And so my mom was like, they're going to get buried at home, like in their yard? Yes, that's what they wanted. And the idea that they have the space to be able to do that, and the idea that the family will have comfort that they could kind of, you know, commune with their bones if they choose, I think is something also that the family might actually end up treasuring in the long run.
Absolutely.
That connection to Plains is so special. I mean, it was just so clear how much he and his family love Plains. I wonder for you, and this may be a tough question to answer quickly or concisely, so take your time, but looking back now, I mean, as we go forward now that he has passed away and people look back at the legacy of President Jimmy Carter, what are the things you think he will always be remembered for?
I think he will be remembered for using his platform post-presidency for good, and not necessarily for his own self-aggrandizement. I think he will be remembered for being morally consistent, not perfect, but somebody who was actually trying to walk the talk. And I think he will be recognized for being meticulous. And so, you know, that sometimes has some negative connotations to it, but it's that meticulousness that I think informed his ability and his desire to try to live out his faith and to walk the talk.
Andra Gillespie joining us from Emory this morning. And for those of you who are just tuning in right now, we have seen the remains of President Carter loaded onto Special Air Mission 39. We've seen his family following thereafter. It looks like they've gotten the last of them there. I'm sure we can expect to see that door closing here in just a few minutes, because the journey continues on now.
It does. So this is, as we keep saying, kind of a transition to the next stage or the next phase of a state funeral, which state funerals are very precise and very planned out, both because they've been around for a long time, but also because the presidents themselves have input, as we've talked about. And so as you see there, I think they are just about to close the door. This plane will go up to Washington, D.C., and of course the president will lie in state there. And people in Washington, D.C., although we hear it is very cold and covered with snow there, I'm sure many will make sure that they are there on the streets to watch the procession and of course to be there to pay their respects, as we were able to do here at the Carter Center. We should mention, have a team from Fox Fox 5 Atlanta, heading there to Washington, D.C. So we're excited to have them there and share their thoughts and experiences around the clock with us, what they're seeing up there, because of course a lot of people, as we know, tens of thousands made sure to come and pay their respects here in Georgia. We expect it will be a similarly strong turnout in D.C.
Yeah, perhaps one of the best parts about this as well is that after that, everything will continue right on back here to Georgia, right on back down to Plains at that, which is where President Carter will be buried there. So really a full circle journey
it is.
for him when we're talking about that.
And it'll be interesting to see going forward the sort of tourism and the interest in Plains. I think a lot of people now who didn't make it to a Sunday school class, haven't made it there before, are going to say, I don't want to miss another chance to get down there and experience this place that the president held so dear. What do you think it was about Plains, about that area of Georgia that touched President Carter in the way it did?
I think home matters.
It's home.
And so if it's home, then this is a place that's going to be important to you. Also, they were able to make Plains, Rosalind and Jimmy Carter their adult home. So, you know, the house that they lived in until their deaths was the house that they built after their peanut warehouse business and the farm took off. So, you know, there is the connection to having grown up there and having grown up nearby in archery. But then there's also this is where they made their adult home, and this is where they made their mark. This is where they made their friends and their connections. And so I don't discount the importance of place, you know, in people's lives. And these are people who cared about the people who lived in their community. You know, there's an inn in Plains that Rosalind Carter helped to restore after President Carter was voted out of office. And so there's just this idea of investing in the community and being neighbors just like everybody else that I think, you know, is something that's very, very meaningful. And I think that it was sincere.
Yeah, you know, we just got news today about the post office there in Plains that'll be renamed to, I believe it's the Jimmy Carter Post Office, something like that. But you also get the sense in Plains, and I've never had a chance to go, which a perfect opportunity now to get to go and experience that. But the way that Plains embraced the Carters is beautiful as well, and it's, I mean, that's their very own, and they talk so fondly about the Carters, Andra.
Yeah, so part of it is their claim to fame. So I think they would be derelict if they didn't. But you don't have that type of relationship and you don't have that type of love if it wasn't reciprocated. And so if it had been different and the Carters had, you know, been voted out of office and they decided, well, you know, we're going to cash out and go to New York or go to California, I don't think, you know, Plains would still probably have the sign as you entered into town to say this is, you know, where Jimmy Carter lived before he was governor. But it made a lot. Made a big difference that this is where they went back and lived, and they moved back into the same house that they had lived in before he became president of the United States. They still had the same routines, they still had the same friends, they were still close with people with whom they had been close for their entire lives. There's just a certain consistency in that behavior that speaks to the depth of building relationships and the value of investing in people.
Yeah, they invested in that community for sure. We heard during one of the live reports this past week, there was a woman being interviewed who lives there in Plains who said there are a lot of small southern towns that are struggling, and we're not struggling, and that's because of the Carters, and because of them we're on the map, so to speak. And speaking of holding Plains as that place of home, I remember when we were there to go to the Sunday school class. After Sunday school was finished, we were there for news coverage, and we were invited back to a family luncheon. And so I was with Tim Whaley, our photographer, and you know, Tim and I always have a good time anywhere we go, so we were very excited about this. So we went to a neighbor's house to have a luncheon, and it was very informal, and we were there in the kitchen, looked up, and all of a sudden there went President Jimmy Carter walking through the kitchen, and then there went Rosalind Carter walking through, and they were there at the neighbors to say hi and have a bite to eat. It was certainly an imposter syndrome moment for me, saying, do they know that I'm here? I don't think I'm supposed to be here. But it just shows you that community. It was that place of home where they felt welcome, the people felt welcome around the Carters, and certainly that seems like it'll continue going forward with people coming into town wanting to see what this small town is all about.
Such a big piece of their story.
Yeah, and I think it's the value of small town living and then also small churches. If you go to a mega church, stuff like that doesn't happen, or maybe you break off in pockets and go to brunch with people. But the idea of people having hospitality and, you know, people regularly meeting at somebody's house for fellowship after a service is something that, you know, we sometimes forget about when we live in a big city like this, that you can actually get away with doing those kinds of things. My mom was telling me about my childhood church. Apparently, because it's a much smaller congregation now, they all go to lunch afterwards. And my first question was, who's paying for it? Church is paying for it. And I knew that would happen because I knew the people I grew up with.
Yeah.
Of course. Yeah, love to hear that. And if you're just joining us on this journey that today we saw go from the Carter Center and then that motorcade make their way to Dobbins Air Reserve Base. And right now we're looking at the plane. You can see Special Air Mission 39 as it prepares to take off to Joint Base Andrews, where that journey will then continue on in to Washington, D.C., and then in a few days will make its way right back here to Georgia and ultimately to Plains.
And something we'll watch, I'm sure, live here on Fox 5 a little bit later is that, as we've been mentioning, once he's there in D.C., they're going to go straight to the U.S. Navy Memorial in Washington, D.C. And of course, that is out of respect to his Navy service. He graduated from the Naval Academy, as we've talked about, back in the 1940s. And then he was, and this is really interesting, he was pulled into submarine service, and it was like nuclear submarine work going on, right?
He was on the cutting edge of the work that was being done in the late 40s and 50s. He worked for, I believe it was Admiral Rickover, who is considered kind of the father of the nuclear Navy. And so he was taking the skills that he had acquired at the Naval Academy and at Georgia Tech and was applying them to figuring out how to, you know, command nuclear-driven submarines. And so from that, he was kind of able to make the claim that he was a nuclear engineer.
Wow.
But it's that attention to detail and that meticulousness that he learned over time and certainly cultivated and honed in the Navy that certainly, you know, translated into his attention to detail as a policy wonk and as a politician.
And something else he brought with him too was a business acumen, because we talked about this earlier, that we sort of have this idea in our head of what being a peanut farmer means, that it was one guy out there alone in the field, when in reality this was a big business, and he was in charge of making sure that once these peanuts were grown, they were going places and making money.
Yeah, so I mean, he was involved in the cultivation and growing of peanuts, but I don't know if this would be the more lucrative side of the business. Another important part of agriculture that we don't think about is processing. What do you do when you've harvested a crop? And so there, you know, is an industry of people who kind of have to play the middleman in terms of getting it processed so that it's fit for consumption, whether it's for animals or for people, and then, you know, helping to make sure that it gets into the supply chain in terms of distribution. And so the peanut processing warehouse that the Carter family had, that Jimmy built upon with you know, after his father passed away, is certainly something that's important. And I think that that is important for us to realize that he's not just some kind of rural farmer who doesn't know anything else about the world. That requires business acumen. That requires management. That has lots of people and employees that are involved in what's going on. And so President Carter, you know, was more than just a humble farmer or even a genteel farmer. He's also you know, a businessman and can bring that knowledge and that expertise to his public service as well.
Andrew, but the headline itself, I can only imagine, you know, when I guess then before he was president, the headline of a peanut farmer who'd been governor of Georgia running for president. I can only imagine that that's something that grabbed attention all over the place, Andra.
Right, and it was to his advantage. So Carter at the time was trying to present himself as an outsider. I am not the politics as usual. Americans are sick of the politics as usual that led to the resignation of a president. I'm going to represent a new way. I'm going to do this differently, but I actually do have more experience than I'm going to let on. You know, in popular culture, you know, he was often maligned, or his family was often maligned or jeered at. So if you go back to classic 1970s sitcoms, as I am prone to do, in the late 1970s, there are lots of jokes about draws or the colorfulness of Miss Lillian and Billy Carter. But I think, you know, he was really trying to upend that stereotype about Southerners, perhaps talking slower, not being as smart, by saying, I'm a businessman, I'm a nuclear scientist. I graduated respectively from the U.S. Naval Academy, and I think he's really trying to burnish this new image for the South, which is why even as governor, he was heralded as sort of part of that vanguard of new Southern Democratic governors who were not going to carry on the business as usual from the Jim Crow era.
And as we said earlier, I mean, that idea of being an outsider was important because you're coming off of the Vietnam War, you're then going into the Watergate scandal, and there was such turmoil and distrust of government at that point. So it was and must have been powerful to hear somebody look you in the eye and say the words, "I won't lie to you."
Yeah, and the fact that it was believed because he was a Sunday school teacher, and somebody, who people could attest to had done Christian missionary work up at the Eastern Seaboard, right, is something that he was trying to use to his advantage. He was trying to say, look, I am not like these other people. Take a chance on me, and it worked.
Right.
Yeah. Andra, Jimmy Carter was, what was it, right after mid-50s, just a young, I'm going to call him a young guy when he left the Oval Office to begin his new life. He could have done so many different things with that, but he basically, it was unprecedented. The way that he jumped into action, formed the Carter Center, the work that was done through all of that, it could have gone a different way. I mean, he really did pave his own path. What do you think has been the most extraordinary part of all that? And I think maybe the longest lasting legacy that he'll have from all of that, Andra?
Well, if you think about things that ex-presidents could do with their platform, the idea that you could cash out, that you could, write books, become famous, win Grammys, and do all of those kinds of things, right? He could do that in a very self-serving kind of way and not help other people, not cure disease, not continue to promote peace around the world, not monitor elections and do things to help promote democracy around the world, and still have those achievements, and we would be talking about them today. But President Carter, by being kind of outward facing and focusing on these larger issues, was actually able to do all of the things that people think about in terms of quote unquote cashing out from a presidency. And I don't mean this from a monetary standpoint, but if you think about all of the books that he was able to write, if you think about the Grammys that he won, if you think about, being able to make the news at strategic points, those are all things that he was able to do because he focused on others as opposed to focusing on self.
Yeah, just an incredible legacy. And of course, we are watching the plane now. It is moving.
Wheels in motion.
So it is just about to depart Dobbins Air Reserve Base here in Metro Atlanta on its way north to a very cold and very snowy Washington, D.C.
Absolutely. We'll make a stop at Joint Base Andrews there before continuing on to Washington, D.C., where that'll begin really the next phase of this memorial, this act of remembering President Carter. Well, he will lie in state there at the U.S. Capitol. A ceremony will commence there. A few days later, he'll return right back here to Georgia and ultimately to Plains. But yeah, wheels in motion, Paul, and this really begins the next step in this journey.
And isn't it beautiful the way the sun is gleaming off of the plane there? I mean, it may be quite cold and blustery there, but what a beautiful day to take him and his family up in the air, to have them head up to Washington, D.C. They will be back. It's going to be just a short time in Washington, D.C. He will lie in state there. There will be ceremonies there, and then, of course, he'll be brought back to Georgia. When he arrives in Washington, D.C., we mentioned the motorcade will head to the U.S. Navy Memorial in D.C. That's a nod to his naval service. You're going to see more kind of ceremonial touches. The Special Honor Guard will move into position as soon as the plane lands and taxis and parks. The family will disembark first, and then the military body bearer team will take the casket out of the loader, and then you're going to hear more music. They'll do another Hail to the Chief. They will do another 21-gun salute to welcome his remains to the nation's capital.
Yeah, the music we've mentioned, Paul, has been such a part of this. So there in D.C., we will be hearing Abide With Me. I think it's so interesting to hear the songs that were chosen by this that I know have his fingerprints all over them, chosen for a specific reason. His family will also be there as well. Members of his cabinet, people who've been there with him every step of the way, will have a chance to see there at Joint Base Andrews as well.
And lawmakers today, current politicians, will be there, of course, to pay their respects. He certainly had an impact on them, and it's so interesting, I'm sure certainly for you as a professor at Emory, Andra, to think about his presidency and the way that we regard him in comparison to the presidents that have followed him, and some of the things they have taken from him and some of the things they have not taken from him.
I think a really important lesson for us to think about here is that the work of a president actually extends into their successor's term. So there are often things that get started in one president's term where you don't actually see the effects of them until, the next president or maybe 2 presidents down the line. And so we could think about things like super funds that we might take for granted today, but were things that were started during the Carter administration. I think that's an important lesson for us to think about as we evaluate presidents. And if I go back over the grand scheme of time and I look at presidential rankings, if I go back to this century, so going back to 2000, President Carter ranks in the middle. So his usual ranking is somewhere between 22 and 27. And so there are certainly presidents who have served after him who rank higher than he did, who are perceived to have had a greater impact. And then there are those who rank lower than he did. But in general, I think if we think about what people felt about him on January 20th, 1981, for instance, I think people have a much more favorable impression of him today, in part because we have the time of distance to be able to see, look, there are certain things that were out of his control. There are things that anybody perhaps could have, messed up and not done as well with. And then there are also ways that you could see the legacy extend over time, and we actually realize, hey, that didn't seem like a big deal then, but that actually is really important and actually pretty favorable now. And then also, people who make these rankings are actually affected by sort of what post-presidencies are. And so the fact that he had a successful post-presidency, I think, does actually factor into the relatively favorable impression that historians who make these rankings tend to ascribe to presidents.
It's such a long post-presidency.
Absolutely, right? Yeah. So much there. It's wheels up right now, though, as you're seeing live on your screen there from Special Air Mission 39. As it takes off right now for Joint Base Andrews, where it will be received with ceremony there. I think we expect that to land there in Maryland at about 2:15. So not too long of a journey to get there. Right.
And then it will, of course, the ceremonies will continue once the plane lands, and there will be a lot going on there. And of course, we will have live team coverage right here on Fox 5 Atlanta following every single bit of it. Of course, this is a big deal for us. Not only was he the president of the United States, he is the only Georgian to become president. So he is one of our own, has left certainly not just that global impact, but such a huge impact on the state, accomplished so much that we talk about now as governor, getting the ball rolling with bringing the film industry here. A lot of state parks are in place now because of the work that Governor Carter did. So we certainly
to, of course, thank Andra for being here today and the insight that you provided. Andra Gillespie, associate professor there at Emory. Thank you so much for coming in and sharing this with us. And it's so interesting, the stories that have come out of this, the facts, and of course, you're getting to hear about your personal relationship with him as well.
Thank you. It's my privilege to be able to honor President Carter.
Thank you. It's been so great to have you. Thank you for your insight. And so again, the coverage will continue. We are watching the plane in the air right now, but as you mentioned, it should be landing here quite shortly, and then our team coverage will continue after that. We expect it on the ground in Maryland about 2:15. The motorcade will depart around 2:45 with a 3:15 arrival at the U.S. Navy Memorial. And of course, we've talked about how important that is, nodding to his service in the United States Navy.
Of course, President Carter's remains will then be transferred to a horse-drawn case with ceremony there, and we will be showing you that as well. Remember, you can catch this live on air. You can also download Fox Local, and we'll have this streaming there as well. Now, the funeral, following that, the funeral procession up to the U.S. Capitol, where the president will be lying in state in the rotunda. That begins, our live coverage on that begins at 2:15, but he'll be lying in state there beginning tonight, I believe at 7 until midnight today.
Yeah, again, you'll see it all right here. Of course, Fox Local is your place to watch coverage 24 hours a day. You can stream Fox Local. Please do that. Again, we so appreciate you being here with us and watching history happen before our eyes. So we'll have more coming up, including a check on the weather. That's very important. It's getting cold outside. Coming up after the break. Stay tuned.